Good evening, everyone. We're here to talk about authorizing war when politics and national security intersect to make hard choices even harder. And tonight we're looking at the International and National Security Law Practice Group, which is one of the Federalist Society's 15 practice groups organized by substantive areas of law. Each practice group is led by a chairman and executive committee comprised of two top lawyers from across the country. They meet each month to organize in-person events, webinars, publications, and the panels for the Federalist Society's flagship event, the National Lawyers Convention. You can learn more about the practice groups at FEDSOC.org/practice groups. So tonight we're going to talk to Professor Jamil Jaffer, who's the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute and an assistant professor of law and director of the National Security Law and Policy Program and the nation's first cyber intelligence and national security LLM at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, where he also teaches classes on counterterrorism, intelligence, surveillance, cybersecurity, and other national security matters. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Professor Jaffer.
Thanks for having me, Abigail.
I'll start with a few questions about the practice groups. So how long have you been involved in this practice group?
So I've been involved in the practice group probably since I left the Bush administration back in 2009. So going on now, over 10, 12 years.
And how can you describe the work of your particular group?
So, the practice group brings a group of lawyers together and we plan events. We plan panels, we plan discussions. We have the annual the annual Federal Society conference, the student conference, the lawyers conference. So we basically, plan events and papers and the like that can bring the work that we do in international law and national security to the rest of the Federal Society members, the larger community, the like. And we'll often engage in debates, not necessarily within the group, sometimes within the group, but more often out in public that on the issues of the day.
And how has your membership in this practice group and in the Federalist Society more broadly enriched your career?
Well, look, in a word, being a member of the Federalist Society all the way from when I started in law school as a 1L has been instrumental in my career. It's been at the heart of a lot of the opportunities I've gotten, a lot of the work I've gotten to do, both in government, but also in the private sector. I love to give back. I think the Federal Society is a hugely important organization. It's important to have these debates, both between conservatives and libertarians inside the Federal Society, but also with folks on the outside. One of the things that I love about the Federal Society and our practice group is similar, is that we always bring in another perspective, and we always want to have the debate. My working theory is that, our ideas will win because they're better, and that we should subject them to testing of the kind that goes on in law schools and courtrooms all around the country.
That sounds great. Is there a way for students to get involved or recent graduates?
Yeah, absolutely. So students can follow what the practice group is doing and its activities on the Federal Society website. You can also email info@federalsociety.org, at fedsoc.org, if you want to get involved and have more specific questions about getting specifically involved with a particular practice group. But all of the practice groups have information about them on the website, as well as information on when their events are and the like. And so we're hosting events, every few weeks.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for telling us a little bit about your practice group.
Absolutely.
And now we get to talk about your amazing career. So what has been your involvement in the realm of enhanced interrogation and national security?
Well, so I've never been directly involved in enhanced interrogation. By the time I arrived at the Justice Department and in the Bush administration, largely the enhanced interrogation program had come to a close. President Bush, I was actually at the Justice Department in the Office of Legal Policy, apparently while the program was still going on. But by the time I came to the National Security Division, which had sort of some amount of involvement or at least oversight over programs related to that, the program had been ended. The president announced the closure of or the transfer of the detainees then in the program back in 2006, declassifying the fact of the program. But my main role in it was at one point there was an accommodation made between the government, the Department of Justice, the White House, and the House and Senate Judiciary Committees, and the White House agreed to show the Judiciary Committees all the legal materials, the legal analysis that was behind the program. Right. So if you recall, the program involved the detention of terrorist suspects located overseas, The application to some of those terrorists, not all of them, or suspected terrorists, the use of a variety of techniques, ranging from a facial grab, where you sort of pull the person close to you, all the way to the most extreme of the techniques that was authorized, the waterboard, which became sort of famous in public lore. And what was interesting about the Judiciary Committee is at the time, they didn't know anything about this. They knew what anybody else knew in the sense they had read the newspapers, right? But they hadn't been given any classified information. So what they were going to learn about was all the stuff that was in these legal memos from the first day the program was conceived of and authorized, and lawyers looked at it at the Justice Department, all the way to the most recent analyses that have been redone over the years. And so they'd called in two lawyers who, like the members of the Judiciary Committee, didn't know anything about the program other than what they had read in the newspapers. And I was one of them, and there was another colleague of mine. And we were told, okay, here's a binder of materials, read it cover to cover, and tell us what's the reaction going to be for somebody who just knows what's in the newspapers. And so that's how I first got involved.
And when you were reading through those binders, did you have any knowledge of any of those programs, or what was your reaction to learning that information?
Yeah, so I mean, look, we knew that the president authorized this covert program, putting terrorists in locations overseas, and then interrogating them. And we knew that one of the techniques, the most extreme, the waterboard, right, was out there, because that had been discussed in the papers. It wasn't declassified, but it had been discussed publicly. What we didn't know was all the other techniques that were used. And again, some were fairly, whatever you look, none of these techniques would have been used in a normal law enforcement setting, obviously. But some of them were more benign than others, right? There was this facial grasp, sort of a open-handed slap across the face or in the belly, right? But they went to, the extreme of the waterboard. And in between were some interesting techniques that I thought, as it turns out wrongly, that members of Congress would get very exercised and concerned about, right? Specifically, the use of sleep deprivation, where we kept folks, awake in sort of an artificial sense for over 100 hours at a time. By sort of having them shackled and have them lean forward, so that when they fell asleep, they would tip forward and it would jerk the shackle and they would wake back up. And so, pretty tough way to be kept. And they were not wearing hardly any clothes. And so it was designed to keep them awake in a very uncomfortable position, so that they would, ultimately provide information. I thought that was a pretty interesting and sort of, forward-leaning technique that would get a lot of attention and a lot of concern from members of Congress. The other one I thought that was going to raise concerns was a technique called walling, where you would take the person, the detainee, you'd put them in a C-collar, right, the thing that protects your neck, and then you'd push them up against a wall sort of aggressively. They would believe that they were hitting the wall, that was a concrete or a brick wall, when in fact the wall was designed to actually flex backwards and absorb them hitting it, so they didn't actually get injured. They had the C-collar on, and they go into this flexible wall, but the sound it made and the feeling of it, the physiological feelings, they couldn't see the wall behind them, felt like they were hitting a brick wall. And so those two, walling and sleep deprivation, I thought would get a lot of attention from the committee. As it turns out, they asked me to, because I was one of the few people the Justice Department, read into the program, which meant that I had access to the program. I had to keep, by the way, these materials, these highly classified materials, in a separate safe inside my skiff, where I had all sorts of other classified material. But because there were so few people in the Justice Department read in, we had to maintain a separate safe for this material. So anyways, because I was one of the few people the Justice Department read in, they said, well, you got to go babysit these documents now up on the Hill when these members are looking at them. So up I go, and, sat there for hours while members of the Judiciary Committee tromped in and read they couldn't take the documents out. They had to sit there in the room and read it and then walk out, just like we had to do. And, come to pass that nobody really cared about anything other than the waterboard. I mean, eventually, people talked about these other techniques, but there wasn't a lot of concern amongst the members of Congress who read them like I thought there would be. So my assessment of it was just totally wrong. And I'd gotten the Justice Department all spun up and worried about what was going to happen. And it turns out, the waterboard was all anybody cared about.
That is really a fascinating story. And so cool that you kind of got to see the inside baseball of that. Going from your time in the DOJ, then through in your position with the Senate, and then now that you're kind of on the private side of things, how has your relationship to national security changed?
Well, it's weird, right? Because back in those days, like 07, 08, 09, I was in the middle of it from a legal perspective, right? We were doing the analysis of very forward-leaning intelligence operations, what's now been declassified as the president's surveillance program, right? All the metadata programs that Edward Snowden revealed, all the content collection, both internet and telephony. Some of the more interesting cyber operations that we began conducting offensive cyber operations, providing legal advice to the NSA, U.S. Cyber Command, FBI, CIA on these operations, and also, working on surveillance orders to obtain the authority was really really a cool thing to be doing, right? So you're doing it in the middle of all that. Then you go to the Hill, like I did after the Bush administration. A few years after that, I went to the House Intelligence Committee, and there we're conducting oversight and sort of looking at these programs from the other side and sort of, critiquing them and trying to address the authorities and figure out whether the right thing is being done. And trying to work on new laws like a cyber intelligence sharing law that we worked on at the House Intelligence Committee that was ultimately enacted in 2015. And then fast forward to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and there you're looking at all sorts of things like sanctions on Russia for their first invasion of Ukraine, authorizing the president to use force against Syria to respond to chemical weapons attacks, forcing the president to submit the Iran nuclear deal to congressional review and a vote of both houses. And then you go to the private sector and you're like unplugged from the matrix, right? That's what my friend Matt Olson, who I used to work for and is now the Assistant Attorney General for National Security in this administration, he refers to as being unplugged from the matrix, right? Because you have all this classified information in your head, right? But you're no longer able to access it. You can't talk about it, right? It's all in your brain. You know it. You can't forget it, but you can't ever talk about it again. And then you're sitting on the outside and you're trying to talk about policy and you're writing think tank pieces and you're talking to people on the Hill and you still know everything you know, but you can't tell them about it because you're not authorized to. And so you're it's a really weird place to be. And then what's really cool is now I'm in the private sector. And for the last 6.5 years, I was a cybersecurity startup where we helped companies defend themselves from nation state actors. But I was working for the former director of the NSA, which was super cool. Never thought I'd get a chance to do that. A 4-star Army General Keith Alexander, a great American, by the way. And then, fast forward, and I'm like, I get to go invest money in companies now. I'm working at a venture capital firm called Paladin Capital Group here in DC that invests in dual use technologies, national security, commercial technologies, with a particular focus on cybersecurity. So like, it's been a crazy run going from being, a lawyer in the Justice Department, providing legal advice, and all over the place and now getting to invest money.
So now with your VC group and your think tank public policy group, how has your time on the inside and all the, as you mentioned, the classified information that you have, how has that informed the balance you attempt to strike between national security interests and keeping people safe, but also taking into account their privacy rights and the overreach that can happen there?
Yeah, of course. Well, look, I think the government, and in particular the NSA, FBI and as well, gets a really bad rap and has gotten a really bad rap, not just generally. It's typically was something that liberals always complained about, right? The abuses that the government might engage in. Conservatives have now become ensconced with these concerns as well. In part, there's always been a strong civil libertarian movement within the conservative movement. But on top of that, right, we saw what happened during President Trump's time in office, and in particular, the Crossfire Hurricane investigation, where an FBI lawyer actually lied and took information that person was a CIA asset, changed it to was not a CIA asset, and then sought surveillance orders against this person, Carter Page. In something that was outrageous and clearly a violation of his ethical duties, a violation of his oath of office, and frankly should have gotten him permanently disbarred and sent to jail. He ultimately pled out, and as I understand, may have even got his bar license back, which to me is crazy. This person should have gone to jail. But as a general matter, what you hear about what the government is doing is oftentimes an overstatement what the government's really doing, right? So you think about, you hear about this dragnet surveillance and warrantless wiretapping and all these things. And then you find out the reality of it is that when the Department of Justice released a few years ago the public numbers about how many people are under surveillance under Section 702, the broad authority that allows us to collect in the United States against foreign actors overseas, it was a few 100,000. Now that may sound like a lot of email addresses and phone numbers, but you think about it in a world of 7-8 billion people, right? And even in a country, the US of 350 million, they can't surveil in the United States, by the way, under that authority. It's only for foreigners overseas. A few 100,000 is nothing. It probably doesn't even total up, all the Russian and Chinese intelligence officers, much less all the intelligence people you want to collect against, all the international leaders and the like, Harris and the like, that you might want to collect against. So the fact that we only have that many under collection suggests it's a fairly careful and targeted effort. You look at the American numbers, right? They range from, in any given year, a couple of thousand, a few hundred Americans under surveillance for national security purposes. And that's with a federal court order, essentially, not a warrant, but something close approaching a warrant, probable cause to believe that American is a foreign power, an agent of a foreign power decided by a federal judge. And by the way, when you do hear about these errors, these failures, and the FBI, went too far and exceeded the bounds of the order, 99 times out of 100, it's the FBI that found the error, right? reported it to the court, and then worked with the court to address the issue. And so, and in particular, the NSA, which is thought of as like a giant vacuuming agency, it's actually one of the most careful, diligent. The people who work there are, careful to a fault. They try to avoid doing anything edgy. It's actually, it's like the kid who, is really trying hard to do the right thing, and oftentimes just makes a mistake and gets beaten up for it. I oftentimes feel that way about the NSA in particular, because it really, other agencies maybe sort of run a little bit more edgy. The NSA is very straight-laced when it comes to intelligence agencies, and that's not the story you hear in public generally, not amongst liberals, and nowadays not amongst conservatives either.
Yes, I think most people would be surprised to hear that the NSA does get a bad rap. Since you have kind of been in this realm under multiple administrations now, and administrations that have taken wildly different approaches, how have you seen the approach to national security internationally change during your time in this field?
Well, look, we've been in a position, I think, now for essentially 12 consecutive years where we have had presidents who aren't particularly interested in the U.S. engaging substantively overseas, right? President Obama, famously talked about leading from behind, right? President Trump, wanted to focus at home and sort of was like, let the world deal with itself, and gave a upturned palm to our allies on a number of occasions, with important exceptions, right? And important times where President Trump did engage, to confront our adversaries, Qasem Soleimani, the killing of the leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Quds Force, an obvious different example. But as a general matter, President Trump was more concerned domestically and thought foreign affairs were something that ought to be, left alone, or that could be handled sort of with a fairly rough hand. And then President Biden, of course, has demonstrated time and again the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, right? That he's not ready to engage Ukraine, just pouring money in and only slowly upping the weaponry, really not substantively, engaged in deterring what should have been a deterrence effort against the Russians. It really didn't turn out that way. And so what you've seen is really a lack of leadership in the United States in terms of leading abroad, but also leadership in the United States of explaining to the American people why we need to be in Ukraine, right? Why we need to respond aggressively to Chinese threats against Taiwan, why staying in Afghanistan, or at least getting our Afghan allies out in a substantive way without handing that nation back over to the Taliban, who controlled it on the day the 9/11 attacks happened, right? Why that was a terrible idea, and why doing it the way we did it was atrocious, right? We need real leaders to speak to the American people, because I really believe, while the American people are certainly tired of a long years and years of war in Afghanistan, years and years of war in Iraq, if we were called to it as a nation and needed to take action, I think the American people would be with a president who was ready to lead. And we haven't seen that in at least 12 years, Republicans and Democrats alike. We may have, George W. Bush was called to lead because of his circumstances, right? And he did that in a strong way, right? But sort of somebody who's built, that way from day one, Reagan, we go back to Reagan, right? And you look at Reagan today, according to Donald Trump, right? Being a Reagan Republican is a bad word, right? Which to me is crazy, right? He called Ron DeSantis a Reagan Republican as an insult. To me, it just sort of, it goes along with, you look at what's happening at CPAC and you see people talking about how great Vladimir Putin is and waving the Russian flag. And I mean, Ronald Reagan is spinning in his grave at that kind of conservatism, because that is not conservatism, at least as Reagan understood it.
Harkening back to a comment you made about your time reviewing the internal documents regarding enhanced interrogation.
Yeah.
When you were in DOJ, did you see a difference in, was there maybe a coherent narrative about the mission or the goals of these international efforts that isn't really communicated clearly to the public?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the Bush administration tried really hard to protect the nation at a time of very real threat, right? It's easy now, 20 plus years later, to say, well, it's hard to think about why they did the things they did, why they use enhanced interrogation, why they have these broad surveillance programs where they were collecting all this metadata, right? And you have to remember that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, including the 8 years that President Bush was in office after that day, right, we were on constant watch for the next terrorist attack. I mean, there were times in the summer 2007, I remember being at the Justice Department, our collection ability was decreasing rapidly because a couple of judges had curtailed the amount of authority we had. At the same time, the terrorist chatter was increasing to levels that were unprecedented since 9/11. And we were extremely concerned that a terrorist attack was in the planning, in the final stages of being executed, and that we would miss it if we didn't have the capabilities that we needed. Now, it turns out that either through a combination of our pressure on Al-Qaeda or their failure to plan or whatever it was, a successful mass casualty terrorist attack of the kind of 9/11 hasn't happened since then. But I do think a lot of that is we have had significant pressure. I mean, the worst job to have in the world was number 3 in Al-Qaeda, right? The operational head of Al-Qaeda, because we killed a dozen of them, like over the years. Just they would be on the battlefield. There's in Pakistan, all of a sudden, boom, they explode. It's weird. I don't know, just spontaneously exploding terrorists, right? It kept happening over and over and over again. That pressure made it very hard to plan. It's very hard to plan when you're hiding in a house in Abbottabad, living on the top floor, not seeing anybody, operating through 1 or 2 couriers and pacing around on a covered balcony, right? It's impossible to lead from that perspective. And that's what we forced Al-Qaeda into because we get the pressure on, right? Now the president tells us the war on terror is over. We've won. We can leave Afghanistan safely. I guess we'll see.
Well, we're going to open it up to some Q&A from the attendees here in a minute. If you guys want to submit questions through the Q&A feature, it should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And while you guys are typing some out, our chapter was hoping you could tell us a little bit about what you think about the Chinese spy balloon, if you have some thoughts on that.
The Chinese spy balloon. Well, look, every nation spies on other nations, right? We do it from outer space. We do it through signals intelligence, right? We do it through all sorts of methodologies, right? And, it's not unlike the US to fly planes over foreign territory. We did it with the SR-71 Blackbird. We did it with the U-2, right? We almost certainly do it today in other countries with other capabilities, right? Either from satellites or from airborne assets. And so it's not surprising our adversaries do it too. The appalling thing is they got away with it for so long, right? As it turns out, there were multiple spy balloons during the Trump administration. If the current White House is to be believed, there was a spy balloon before they found this one. In fact, that's sort of how they figured this out, that what this was. But then the fact that, we sort of tracked it, didn't do anything about it. The claim was, it might hurt somebody if we shoot it down over, rural Montana. I mean, that seems crazy. And then we heard, they had blocked the transmission, so it didn't get through. Now we're finding out, it turns out that communications did get back to China as the balloon transited over very sensitive military sites. So, look, we caught them. We shot it down. The Chinese expressed some amount of unhappiness, but, they got caught, and there was nothing illegal or improper about us shooting down something unlawfully flying over our airspace. That was the right thing to do. We should have done it earlier. Then the hard and the embarrassing part, the rough part is, right, so then we sort of turn up the surveillance, right? We'd been sort of cutting out a lot of noise in the system. So now we start seeing balloons everywhere. It turns out some of these balloons were just ham radio projects, and so we had F-22s using Sidewinder missiles shooting down ham radio projects over Canada. I mean, it's funny and embarrassing a little bit, right? But we were trying to do the right thing, right? And so it just demonstrates that we need different and better capabilities, right? And so at a time when people are saying, we need to cut defense spending right now, the war on terror is over, the war on Ukraine, maybe it shouldn't matter to us, we need to reduce defense spending now, we're in a time of economic challenges. That is exactly the wrong answer. Every single time our nation has cut defense spending, thought about the peace dividend and the like, we've been confronted with a major threat, whether that was 9/11 or before that, multiple wars. And so, because people see our adversaries watch everything we do. They watch how we spend, they watch how we talk, they watch how presidents talk about the preparedness of this country for conflict. And when they see presidents that are weak or worried about going to war or concerned about it, they take advantage. It's no surprise that Vladimir Putin went into Ukraine, right, and took Crimea the first time, when he realized that Barack Obama wasn't going to conduct a strike against Syria after setting a red line. It's no surprise after the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, Vladimir Putin went back into Ukraine. There's no surprise that for years, both under the Trump administration and dramatically more so under the Biden administration, that China's been threatening Taiwan over and over again, right? They see America as weak, unwilling to be a good friend to its allies and an aggressive adversary to its enemies. And that's when our enemies act and they take action. And it's not just nation states, it's terrorist groups too.
Well, thank you. We have a really great question here from a student, Tim Keene.
Yeah.
Professor, during your days working on national security policy, you worked on the drafting of proposed authorizations for the use of military force against ISIS in 2014 and 2015.
Yeah.
Would you please describe the work that goes into drafting that kind of legislation? For example, what stakeholders should be consulted? How cautious should policymakers be when reviewing shifting intelligence reports related to rapidly developing emergencies, like the rise of ISIS in the 2010s?
So this is actually going to make you crazy, because this is going to worry you about how our government works, right? So it turns out the whole, so President Obama had set a red line, said, look, if chemical weapons are used in Syria, I'm going to respond militarily. He then decides he's going to do it, then takes a long walk around the White House lawn with one of his close advisors, and decides ultimately that he's going to go on stage, announce as commander in chief, I've decided to strike Syria and enforce the red line, but I want Congress to authorize it first, which sort of, is an interesting way to frame it, but okay, whatever. So he says that I'm in LA with my family because my father had cancer at the time. And I was visiting my father, and I get the phone call. I'm the chief counsel for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and it's the Foreign Relations Committees that draft authorizations to use of military force. I'm the minority chief counsel. Democrats had control of the Senate. I get a call from my staff director, Les Munson. He says, you got to come back. We got to work on an AUMF. I'm like, hey, that's actually funny. I have a draft AUMF, because we'd been sitting in a meeting with the King of Jordan, and he had been talking about threats from states in the region and threats in Syria. And so just sort of sitting there, I guess I think at this point we had Blackberries. We still have Blackberries, right? So I'm literally sitting on my Blackberry, and I'm like typing, what would an AUMF look like along the lines the King of Jordan is talking about? And so I'd had like a little draft ready to go. So I sent it over to my boss, and I get on, I go to LAX, get on a plane, fly back to DC. And so we're negotiating with Democrats, right? So it's Bob Menendez is the senator. Senator Menendez is the chairman. Bob Corker, my boss, is the ranking member, and the staff is sent off to go and draft this AUMF, right? While the members are discussing it. And at one point, we had largely agreed on language, but the president had made clear he didn't want to put any ground troops in. He wasn't seeking authority for ground troops, even though when he set up his request, it was a broad, wide open, we can do anything for as long as we want in Syria to respond to the threat. It was clear the president made clear he didn't need ground troops. So we're sitting there in this room, and I remember we're in the back room. So it's me, Jody Herman, who is the chief counsel for the Democrats, the staff director, her chief counsel, my staff director, and then the majority leader, minority leaders, national security advisors. So 6 of us in a room at the back. The members are holding a hearing about what should be done and about how the conflict should be authorized, and we're negotiating text. And at one point, we're like, how do you write? We had agreed we're going to not authorize troops. We're going to not authorize ground troops, right? Which, by the way, is a crazy thing to do in an authorization, to bar a specific military tool. But there was agreement. That's what we wanted to do. And so this would have been the first ever to be done, to write an authorization like that. And so we're negotiating, and you would think, well, maybe they, if you're trying to figure out how to write this, because you want to allow combat search and rescue, right? You want to have boots on the ground. If a pilot is shot down, you want to go get them on the ground. You want to be able to authorize that too. So how do you write no boots on the ground but allow combat search and rescue? Do you think, oh, well, they probably called somebody at DOD, right? And the Department of Defense had this Yoda-like person who said, oh, well, we did this 20 years ago, and here's how we did it, and here's the information, right? Instead, as it turns out, there's 6 of us in the room, and we're like, yeah, we sort of drafted some language, right? And we sort of came with some words that we thought worked. We showed it to the bosses, right? The senators, right? The other senator took it to their staffs. Everybody sort of agreed on the language, and then the committee voted on it. And there was no call to DOD. There was no Wizard of Oz, old person behind the screen. It was just us, the 6 of us. And had this authorization ultimately gone to the House floor and been passed, and President Obama had acted, that's how the country would have gone to war. And here you are, these 6 people just sort of like trying to figure out what's the right words to use, which is kind of crazy. Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
That is kind of crazy. We have.
100 senators, or whatever, the senators of the committee at least looked at it and voted on it. Their staffs looked at it. So a lot of people looked at it, right? But like in the initial drafting, it was a really small group, and there was no call to the White House being like, "What do you think?"
That is incredible. Relating to going to war, we have another question about the potential war with China. Do you feel that is inevitable, and can public opinion stomach a war of that scale?
Look, I think nothing is inevitable. And so I actually think, that given our current security posture, I think there's a better than even chance, even if there was an invasion of Taiwan, that we would not respond militarily. And that's a terrifying fact. It should be a terrifying fact for the Taiwanese. It should be a terrifying fact for all of our allies in the Indo-Pacific. And it should be a terrifying fact for Americans, because the reality is that even though we might not get involved immediately, the long-term consequences are such that if the Chinese take Taiwan without any fight from the US and our allies, they will not stop at Taiwan. Just like Vladimir Putin didn't stop at Crimea, just like they didn't stop at Hong Kong, just like they didn't stop in interning 1 million Uyghurs, right, in prison camps, or threatening Christians, or threatening Buddhists, right, or acting against ethnic minorities, right? these things will not stop. Hitler didn't stop at one nation, right? And with one country, right? Chamberlain was wrong, right? And so, you know, we will end up in a much larger fight that'll be more costly for the American people in terms of money, in terms of lives, in terms of threats to our security, if we don't act. And unfortunately, I don't think we're ready to act. I don't think the American people are ready. And we don't have the kind of leadership in Washington, and haven't for a decade plus, right, that would actually bring to the American people the reasons why we need to be involved and make the case to them and bring them with our leadership. That kind of leadership is just sorely lacking, not just, and by the way, not just in the White House. This isn't a criticism only of the president, although I think it's directed at the last three presidents, but it's also criticism of members on Capitol Hill, because there are very few members on Capitol Hill today who are ready to vote for an authorization for the use of military force against China with Taiwan. I mean, some of those leaders are good folks. Mike Gallagher, I think, would probably, if you've seen his leadership of the new China Select Committee, along with his ranking Democrat Raja Krishnamurthy, I think you'll see a lot more willingness there. I don't know for a fact, but I think there's a lot of members of Congress who are not prepared to do that, aren't sure it's in the U.S.'s national security interests, and are worried about the loss of life. Which, by the way, we should all be worried about. We should be worried about these things and act carefully. It doesn't mean we shouldn't also realize the long-term consequences of not acting.
Thank you. That question was from Gabriel May, and then we'll take one last question from the audience, from John James, a current 2L. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. His question is that Russia and China have proposed a new currency called BRICS that some reports claim could supplant the American dollar as the global standard currency. What concerns or issues do you see around this proposed currency, and where do you see the proposal moving in the future?
Well, look, I think there's certainly an argument to be made that the Chinese are making a move to try and replace the dollar as the sort of the lingua franca currency, the currency used for most international transactions. They've long wanted to do that. That's why they created the digital renminbi, or the digital yuan, right? Whatever you want to call it. It's why they're trying to get Brazil, Russia, India together with them to create an agreement, an economic effort, a currency. I think, look, this has been tried before. It has been successful. The euro is going to be a competitor to the dollar. That's turned out to not be the reality. But is the loss of American leadership when it comes to the dollar, when it comes to our role in the world as the world's only remaining superpower, is that going to change? Can that change in weeks, days, weeks, months, years? Yes. Is it on the wane right now? Are we losing credibility across the globe? Absolutely. And it's our own fault. We have not wanted to lead for a long time. We've refused to lead. America used to be that country that everyone could count on to be a strong ally and a forceful adversary. We have not been seen as that by either our allies or our adversaries for years. And that is on us. That's on the American people. That's on our leaders. And as long as that happens, the possibility of a BRIC currency, along with other things, are very real, and it's something we should be very concerned about.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. We thank you for taking the time to speak with us this evening. And Absolutely. Everybody, next week, there will be another practice group meeting hosted by UNC School of Law over reflections on 30 years of trial and appellate litigation. So thank you all for coming tonight. Have a great evening.